Marcus Vane had forgotten what it felt like to care about anything at all. And he had been wandering through the galaxy for 3 long years with nothing but emptiness inside his chest where his heart used to be. Ever since the day he watched his wife Sarah and his 7-year-old daughter Elena die in the flames of a raider attack on the colony world of Kepler 442b. He remembered that day with perfect clarity, even though he wished he could forget it. The way the sky had turned orange with fire, the way the screams had echoed through the burning streets, the way he had held Elena in his arms while the light slowly faded from her eyes and she whispered, "Daddy, I'm scared," and then went silent forever after that day. Marcus had stopped being a person and had become something more like a ghost, drifting from job to job across the outer rim territories, taking contracts that no sane person would accept because he no longer cared whether he lived or died. And somewhere along the way he had ended up here on Velis Prime, the most forbidden planet in the entire galaxy. The Velithri were an ancient species that looked like tall cats walking upright on 2 legs, with sleek fur that ranged from silver to gold to deep amber, and eyes like pools of molten honey that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. And they had been traveling between the stars for more than 10,000 years, before the first humans had even learned how to make tools from stone. They considered Velis Prime to be the holiest world in their civilization, the birthplace of their entire species, and at its heart stood the Sanctuary of Endless Whiskers, a temple of black stone that had been standing for 11,000 years and that no outsider had ever been permitted to enter. The punishment for setting foot on Velis Prime without permission was death, immediate and without appeal. But Marcus did not care about death anymore because death would mean seeing Elena again. And that did not seem like much of a punishment at all. He was there illegally, working for a mining corporation that wanted to know if the northern wastes contained valuable minerals worth the risk of angering the Velithri. And he worked alone because he preferred it that way, scanning rocks and taking samples, and trying not to think about anything at all. The storm came on the 3rd day of his survey mission. Marcus had seen bad weather on dozens of worlds across the galaxy, but he had never seen anything like a Velithrian tempest. A wall of wind and ice that swept across the frozen plains with enough force to tear apart anything in its path. And he barely managed to reach his emergency shelter before the full fury of the storm descended upon the land. He waited inside for 2 days while the wind screamed outside like a living thing hungry for his blood. And during those 2 days, he thought about Elena and the way she used to laugh. And he thought about Sarah and the way she used to smile at him across the breakfast table. And he thought about all the things he had lost and would never get back when the storm finally passed. Marcus emerged into a world that had been transformed by violence, the landscape reshaped by wind and ice, his survey vehicle destroyed and scattered across the frozen ground in pieces too small to salvage. And he knew that he would have to walk to the extraction point if he wanted to survive. He did not particularly want to survive, but he started walking anyway because that was what his body did now. It kept moving even when his mind had given up. And that was when he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. There was a small shape in the snow about 100 meters from his shelter, a bundle of amber fur half buried in the gray ice. And at first Marcus thought it was some kind of animal that had died in the storm, but then he saw it move, just slightly, just enough to show that it was still alive. He walked over and knelt down and brushed away the snow. And what he found made his breath catch in his throat. It was a Velithri cub, a baby no larger than a house cat, with amber fur matted with frozen blood, and eyes that were closed, and a small chest that rose and fell, with breaths so shallow they were barely visible. And Marcus could see immediately that she was dying, that the storm had broken her small body in ways that would kill her within hours if she did not receive medical attention. He should have called for Velethri emergency services and walked away, letting her own people deal with her fate, because that was the smart thing to do and the legal thing to do and the thing that would not result in his execution for trespassing on sacred ground. But when Marcus looked at that small broken body lying in the snow, he did not see a Velethri cub. He saw Elena. He saw his daughter lying in the ruins of their home with her eyes closed and her breathing shallow and her life slipping away, while he screamed for help that never came. And something inside Marcus that had been dead for 3 years suddenly woke up with a fury that burned away all the emptiness and filled him with a desperate need to save this child. Even if it cost him everything, he picked her up gently, cradling her against his chest the way he used to cradle Elena when she was a baby. And he wrapped her in his thermal blanket to share his body heat with her small freezing form. And he looked south toward the distant shape of the sanctuary of Endless, whiskers rising against the pale sky, 80 kilometers away, through frozen wasteland that would kill an unprotected human in less than an hour, guarded by warriors who were authorized to shoot trespassers on sight, stood the only place on this entire planet that had medical technology advanced enough to save this child. Marcus Vane had no vehicle, limited supplies, a failing heating unit, and a cub whose heartbeat grew weaker with every passing minute. He started walking south because 3 years ago, he had held his daughter in his arms and watched her die while he begged the universe for a chance to save her. And the universe had not listened. But now the universe had given him another child to save, and he was not going to waste this second chance. Not for anything, not even for his own life. The first night was a battle against the cold that Marcus fought with nothing but stubbornness and the warmth of his own failing body, walking through darkness so complete that he could not see his own feet, guided only by the distant glow of the temple spire on the southern horizon, and the faint heartbeat of the cub pressed against his chest. His heating unit flickered and sparked and threatened to die with every step, and the temperature dropped so low that his breath froze in the air before it left his lips. But Marcus kept walking because stopping meant death for both of them, and he had not carried this child through a storm just to let her freeze in the darkness. He talked to her as he walked, partly to keep himself awake, and partly because the silence of the frozen wasteland was too much like the silence of a grave. And he told her about Elena, about the way his daughter had loved cats more than anything else in the universe. She had a cat named Whiskers, Marcus said, his voice rough from the cold, an orange tabby that she found behind our housing unit when she was 5 years old. And she carried that cat everywhere she went. Talked to it like it could understand every word, and maybe it could. Maybe cats are smarter than we think. The cub made a small sound against his chest, not quite a meow, but something close. And Marcus held her tighter and kept walking. He told her about the day Elena was born, how he had been so nervous in the hospital that he had knocked over a tray of medical instruments, and how Sarah had laughed at him even though she was the one in labor, and how when the doctor had placed Elena in his arms for the first time, he had felt his entire world shift and rearrange itself around this tiny perfect creature. He told her about Elena's first words, which had been kitty cat, because of course they had been, and about her first steps, which had been toward a stray cat in the park, and about all the small moments that had made up a life that was far too short. By the second day, Marcus could no longer feel his feet, and his fingers had turned white with frostbite, and every step sent waves of pain through muscles that had been pushed far beyond their limits. But he kept walking because the cub was still breathing, and as long as she was breathing, he would not stop. He shared his rations with her, chewing the nutrient paste into a soft mush and letting her lick it from his fingers. And she was too weak to eat much, but she tried, her small tongue rough against his frozen skin. And Marcus told her she was brave, told her she was strong, told her she was going to survive, even though he was no longer sure that was true. On the second night, he found a shallow cave in the ice and crawled inside with the cub, pressing his body against the frozen wall and wrapping himself around her small form to share every bit of warmth he had left. And he did not sleep, because sleeping in this cold would mean never waking up. Instead, he watched the stars through the cave entrance and thought about Elena and wondered if she was watching him from somewhere beyond the darkness. And he hoped that she was proud of what he was trying to do, even if he failed. "I'm sorry, I couldn't save you," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry, I wasn't strong enough or fast enough or good enough, but I'm going to save this one, Elena. I'm going to carry her all the way to that temple, and I'm going to make them heal her. And maybe that won't make up for losing you, but it's all I have left to give." The cub stirred against his chest and opened her eyes for just a moment, amber pools that reflected the starlight. And she looked at Marcus with an expression that seemed almost like understanding before her eyes closed. Again, when dawn came, Marcus stood up on legs that should have failed him and walked out of that cave and continued south. Because he was human, and humans did not know how to quit, even when quitting was the sensible thing to do. The Velothri patrol found him around midday on the third day. There were 5 of them, warriors in silver armor that gleamed in the pale sunlight, each one standing over 2 meters tall, with fur ranging from gray to black and eyes that burned like golden fire. And they moved with the fluid, deadly grace of predators who had never known fear. They surrounded Marcus in seconds, their plasma rifles aimed at his chest. And the leader stepped forward with his teeth bared in what might have been a snarl or might have been something else entirely. And he spoke in a language that sounded like growling and purring, mixed together. The translation implant in Marcus's skull rendered the words, "You are trespassing on sacred ground, human. The penalty is death. You will be executed immediately." Marcus did not raise his hands or drop to his knees or beg for mercy, because his arms were full of a dying child, and he was not going to let her go for anything. "Look at what I'm carrying," he said, his voice raw from cold and exhaustion. "Look at her." He opened his thermal blanket and showed them the cub. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, the warriors making sounds of shock and grief that needed no translation. The leader falling to his knees in the snow with his rifle forgotten beside him. "Irivel," the leader whispered, "the daughter of the high priestess. We've been searching for 3 days. We thought she was dead. She will be dead if you don't let me take her to your temple," Marcus said. "She needs healing that I cannot provide. She needs your technology, your medicine, your priests. And if you kill me here, she dies too." The leader looked at Marcus with eyes that held the same grief Marcus had been carrying for 3 years. The same desperate love for a child in danger. And something passed between them that transcended species and language and ancient law. "Our laws demand your death," the leader said. "No exception, no appeal." "Then kill me after," Marcus said. "But let me save her first." The leader hesitated, torn between duty and compassion. And then he spoke a single word that the translator rendered simply as, "Run." Marcus ran. The Sanctuary of Endless Whiskers was the most magnificent structure Marcus had ever seen. A mountain of black stone that rose from the frozen plain like a fist raised against the sky. Its walls carved with images of Velothri gods and heroes that stretched back to the dawn of their civilization. And its peak was a spire that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. And at its base was a staircase of 212 steps, each one carved from the same black stone and bearing the face of a different Velothri saint, their carved eyes staring down with 11,000 years of judgment. No outsider had ever climbed those steps. No human had ever stood at their base. Marcus began to climb. His legs were screaming with every step. His body pushed so far beyond its limits that he could no longer feel anything but pain and the desperate need to keep moving. But he climbed because at the top of these stairs was the only thing in the universe that could save the child in his arms. Halfway up, the automated defenses came online. Ancient machines humming to life with a sound like thunder. Plasma turrets emerging from hidden alcoves and tracking his movement with deadly precision. Targeting lasers painting his chest with dots of red light that meant death. A voice boomed from speakers hidden in the stone, speaking in the Velethri language, and his translator rendered it as, "You are trespassing on sacred ground. Turn back immediately or you will be destroyed. This is your only warning." Marcus did not turn back. He climbed another step, then another, waiting for the plasma bolt that would end his life. But it did not come, and he realized that the defenses were hesitating. Their ancient programming uncertain how to handle a situation that had never occurred in 11,000 years of history. "Let me in." Marcus shouted at the stone walls and the hidden speakers and whatever minds might be listening. "I have your child. I have the daughter of your high priestess. And she is dying. She is dying right now. And if you don't open these doors, she will die in my arms, just like my daughter died in my arms 3 years ago." There was no response. Marcus kept climbing. His vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and dehydration and the accumulated damage of 3 days of walking through conditions that should have killed him. But he could still see the great gates at the top of the stairs. Massive doors carved from a single piece of black stone that must have weighed thousands of tons. Inscribed with warnings in languages so old that even the Velethri had forgotten how to read them. He reached the top of the stairs and stood before those gates, swaying on legs that could barely hold him upright. And he looked at the doors that had been sealed against outsiders for longer than human civilization had existed. "Please," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper now, cracked and broken from cold and exhaustion. "Please, I have come so far. I have walked through death itself to bring her here. Please don't let her die. Please." The doors did not open. The targeting lasers still painted his chest. The temple remained silent and cold, and utterly indifferent to his suffering. Marcus felt despair washing over him like a wave. The same despair he had felt 3 years ago when he had watched Elena die in his arms. And for a moment, he thought about simply lying down on the cold stone and letting death take them both. But then the cub in his arms stirred little Iravel, who had been unconscious for most of the journey, opened her amber eyes and looked up at Marcus with an expression of pain and fear and something that might have been trust. And she opened her small mouth, and she made a sound that was barely audible. A tiny mew of distress that was swallowed almost immediately by the wind. But it was a sound that the sanctuary had been built to hear 11,000 years ago. When the first Velethri priests designed this temple, they had programmed its systems to respond to one thing above all else: the cry of a Velethri child in distress, because children were sacred to the Velethri, more sacred than any law or tradition or ancient prohibition, more sacred than the purity of their holy places, more sacred than anything else in the entire universe. The great gates. Shuttered Marcus stumbled backward as the massive stone doors began to move for the first time in recorded history, grinding against each other with a sound like the world breaking apart. Dust and ice falling from cracks that had been sealed for millennia. Light poured out from inside the temple. Warm golden light that felt like sunlight on Marcus's frozen skin. And he heard voices shouting in alarm and confusion. Priests and warriors rushing toward the gates to see what was happening. The sanctuary of endless whiskers. The holiest place in Velethri civilization. The temple that no outsider had entered in 11,000 years. Stood open, and Marcus Vane walked through. The inside of the temple was vast beyond comprehension. A cathedral of light and shadow, with vaulted ceilings painted with murals of Velethri, history and pillars carved from precious metals and floors tiled with stones that glowed softly beneath his feet, and everywhere there were Velithri, dozens of them, hundreds of them, priests in ceremonial robes, and warriors with weapons drawn, and elders with gray fur and wide horrified eyes, all of them staring at Marcus as if he were a demon risen from the depths of their oldest nightmares. Marcus walked toward them, carrying the dying cub, his frozen body failing but his spirit burning with a fire that would not be extinguished. "Help her," he said, and his voice echoed through the sacred halls. "Please, help her. I don't care what you do to me afterward. I don't care if you kill me or torture me or make me suffer for 1,000 years. Just please save this child." The crowd parted before him like water before a stone, and at the end of the path they made stood a single figure, an ancient Velithri female with silver fur streaked with white, and eyes that held the weight of 300 years of wisdom and grief. The high priestess Silvara Iravel's mother. She looked at Marcus with an expression that no translation could capture. And then she looked at the bundle in his arms, at her daughter's broken body wrapped in an alien's thermal blanket. And something in her ancient face shattered. "Give her to me," she whispered, and Marcus did. The healing machines of the sanctuary were ancient beyond measure. Technology so advanced that human scientists would not understand it for another 1,000 years. And they hummed and glowed with soft golden light as they wrapped around little Iravel's broken body and began the slow work of putting her back. Together Marcus stood in the corner of the healing chamber, surrounded by armed warriors who kept their weapons trained on him even though he had made no move to resist or escape. And he watched as the machines worked their miracles on the child. He had carried through the frozen wastes. He could not feel his feet anymore, and his fingers had turned an ugly shade of gray. And every breath he took sent sharp pains through his chest. But none of that mattered because Iravel was alive and the machines were healing her, and that was all he had ever wanted. The high priestess Silvara had not left her daughter sighed since Marcus had placed the cub in her arms, and she stood now with her ancient hands pressed against the glass of the healing chamber, watching every movement of the machines with eyes that held equal parts fear and hope. Hours passed in silence. Finally, one of the priest healers approached, Silvara, and spoke softly in the Velithri language. And Marcus watched as the tension slowly drained from the high priestess's body, and she closed her eyes and made a sound that might have been weeping or prayer or both. His translator rendered the healer's words. "She will live. The damage was severe, but the machines have repaired everything. She will carry scars, but she will make a full recovery." Marcus felt his legs give out beneath him, and he collapsed against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor, not caring that the warriors tensed at his sudden movement, not caring about anything except the wave of relief that crashed through him like a tide. She was going to live. The child he had carried through the impossible cold was going to live for the first time in 3 years. Marcus Vane had saved someone instead of watching them die. And even though he knew that what came next would probably be his execution, he found that he did not care, because this moment was worth dying for. Silvara left her daughter's side and walked toward Marcus, her steps slow and deliberate, her ancient eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking directly into his soul and reading every secret he had ever kept. She stopped in front of him and looked down at the broken human sitting on the floor of her sacred temple, and her expression was unreadable, a mixture of emotions too complex for any translator to capture. "You have committed crimes against my people that are beyond forgiveness," she said, and her voice was calm but heavy with authority. "You have set foot on sacred ground that no outsider has touched in 11,000 years. You have entered the holiest place in our civilization. You have forced open gates that were never meant to open for your kind." "I know," Marcus said, and he did not try to stand or defend himself. I knew what I was doing when I did it. I accept whatever punishment you decide. Do you? Silvara said. And there was something in her voice that was not quite anger and not quite curiosity. Do you truly accept death as the price of your actions, human? Marcus thought about the question carefully. Thought about his life and what remained of it. Thought about the 3 empty years since Elena and Sarah had died. I have been ready to die for 3 years, he said finally. Ever since I lost my wife and daughter in a raider attack. I have not feared death because I have had nothing left to live for. I took this job on your planet because I did not care if I survived it. Silvara tilted her head in a gesture that seemed almost cat-like, studying him with those ancient golden eyes. And yet you walked 80 kilometers through a death storm to save a child, she said. You risked everything for a life that meant nothing to you. You violated sacred law and faced certain death for a stranger of another species. That does not sound like a man who does not care whether he lives or dies. Marcus was silent for a moment, trying to find words for feelings he had never spoken aloud. When I found her in the snow, I saw my daughter, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. I saw Elena lying in the ruins of our home with the light fading from her eyes. I saw the child I could not save. And something inside me that had been dead for 3 years suddenly woke up. He looked up at Silvara with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. I could not save my own daughter, he said. I held her in my arms and I begged the universe to let me trade my life for hers, and the universe did not listen. And I have spent 3 years carrying that guilt, that failure, that endless grief. And when I saw your daughter dying in the snow, I knew that I could not let it happen again, even if it cost you your life. Silvara said. Especially if it cost me my life, Marcus said. Because my life without Elena is not worth very much, but her life, your daughter's life, that was worth everything I had left to give. The temple was silent, except for the soft hum of the healing machines and the distant whisper of wind outside the ancient walls. Silvara was quiet for a long moment, her ancient eyes glistening with something that might have been tears. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before. I have lived for 300 years, she said. I have watched civilizations rise and fall. I have seen the best and worst of 100 species. And I have always believed that we Velithri were the pinnacle of moral and spiritual development, that the younger species had nothing to teach us. She knelt down in front of Marcus, bringing her face level with his wrong, she said. Because in 300 years I have never seen anyone do what you did. I have never seen such selfless love, such stubborn courage, such absolute refusal to let a stranger die when there was any chance of saving them. She reached out with one ancient hand and touched his cheek gently. You carry fire in your heart, human, she said. A fire that burns even when all hope is lost. And that fire is something the galaxy has never seen before. What happens now? Marcus asked. Because he genuinely did not know, Silvara smiled. And it was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. Now, she said, we talk about the future. 6 months had passed since Marcus Vane carried a dying cub through the gates of the Sanctuary of Endless Whiskers. And in that time, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Ways that would be studied and debated and celebrated for thousands of years to come. Marcus stood in the great hall of the Galactic Council, wearing ceremonial robes that the Velithri had made especially for him from the finest fabrics their civilization could produce. Robes that bore the symbol of their highest honor, a silver paw print surrounded by 7 stars, marking him as a true friend of the Velithri people. He was about to become the first human ambassador to the Velithri theocracy, a position that would have seemed impossible just 6 months ago, a position that would change the relationship between their species forever. The council chamber was filled with representatives from more than 100 different civilizations, all of them watching with expressions of shock and disbelief as the most reclusive species in the galaxy, prepared to embrace a human as one of their own. High Priestess Silvara stood beside Marcus, her silver fur gleaming in the light of countless holographic displays. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the chamber with the weight of 11,000 years of history. "My people have watched humanity for 3 centuries," she said. "We have watched them fight their wars and make their mistakes. We have watched them stumble through the galaxy like children who have not yet learned to walk. And we judged them unworthy of our attention. Too primitive and too violent to understand the wisdom we could offer." The representatives murmured among themselves. Uncertain where this speech was leading, "We were wrong," Silvar continued. And her voice was clear and strong. "We looked at humanity's worst moments, and we assumed that was all they were. We looked at their violence and their conflict, and we dismissed them as savages who would never amount to anything. And in doing so, we missed the truth of what humanity really is." She turned to Marcus and placed her hand on his shoulder with a gentleness that spoke of deep respect. "This man walked 80 kilometers through a death storm to save a child who was not his own," she said. "He violated our most sacred laws and faced certain execution because he could not bear to let a stranger's daughter die when he had the power to help. He carried fire in his heart when his body should have failed. And he did not stop until my daughter was safe in my arms." The chamber had gone completely silent, every representative listening with rapt attention. "That is humanity," Silvara said. "Not the violence that we feared, not the chaos that we expected, but a stubborn and irrational refusal to abandon those who need help. A burning love that transcends species and culture and ancient law. A courage that does not know how to surrender, even when surrender is the only sensible option." She looked out at the assembled representatives with eyes that held the conviction of absolute certainty. "My people have decided that we were wrong about humanity," she said. "We have decided that they deserve not only our attention, but our respect, our partnership, our friendship, and we have chosen this man, Marcus Vane, to be the bridge between our civilizations." The applause that followed was thunderous. Representatives from across the galaxy rising to their feet to honor a man who had done nothing more remarkable than refuse to let a child die alone in the snow. But Marcus barely heard the applause. His eyes were fixed on a small figure sitting in the front row of the observation gallery, a young Velithri with amber fur and silver scars that traced patterns across her face. Scars that she wore with pride because they reminded her of the day a stranger had carried her through the cold. Irivel waved at him with her small paw, her eyes shining with joy. And Marcus felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in more than 3 years. Hope. After the ceremony, Marcus walked through the gardens of the Velithri embassy, still wearing his ceremonial robes, still trying to understand how his life had changed so completely. And he was not surprised when he heard small footsteps running up behind him. Irivel grabbed his hand with her soft paw and looked up at him, with those amber eyes that he had first seen half closed. "And dying in the frozen snow, warm walker," she said, using the name she had given him. A Velithri phrase that meant one who carries fire in his chest, a name that had no perfect translation, but that Marcus understood in his heart. "Hello, little one," Marcus said, and he knelt down to be at her level. "How are you feeling today?" "Happy," Irivel said simply. "Because you are staying, because you are going to be here with us, because I get to see you every day now." Marcus smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to his eyes for the first time in years. "I'm happy too," he said. "Happier than I have been in a very long time." Irivel was quiet for a moment, her small face serious in a way that made her look older than her years. "My mother told me about your daughter," she said softly. "She told me that you had a child named Elena who died, and that you saved me because you could not save her." Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest, but it was different now, softer somehow. less like a wound and more like a scar that had finally begun to heal. "That's true," he said. "Elena was 7 years old when she died, and she loved cats more than anything in the universe. And when I found you in the snow, I thought about her. I thought about how much she would have wanted me to help you." Irivel climbed into his lap and curled up against his chest. "Just like a cat, just like Elena's old Tabby used to do." And she began to make a sound that was almost like purring. "I want to be your daughter now," she said quietly. "Not to replace Elena, because no one can ever replace her, but to be a new daughter, someone to love and protect. Someone who will love you back." Marcus could not speak for a long moment, his throat tight with emotions he had kept locked away for 3 long years. "I would like that," he finally whispered. "I would like that more than anything." And so Marcus Vane, the broken man who had wandered through the galaxy with nothing but emptiness in his heart, found himself with a new daughter and a new purpose and a new life that he had never expected to find. The Velithri would teach humanity many things in the centuries that followed, sharing technology and wisdom and the accumulated knowledge of their ancient civilization. But humanity would teach the Velithri something even more valuable. They would teach them what it truly meant to carry fire, and little Irivel, the cub who had been saved by a stranger's love, would grow up to become the greatest ambassador her people had ever known, spending her long life building bridges between species and spreading the message that her warm walker had taught her on that frozen day so long ago, that love does not stop at the boundaries of species or civilization, that sacrifice for a stranger is the highest form of courage, that sometimes the most unlikely heroes come from the most unexpected places, and that humanity, for all its flaws and failures and violence, carries a fire in its collective heart that can light up even the darkest corners of the galaxy, because that is what it means to be human, and that is why the galaxy would never underestimate them again.